Hey, thank you everyone for joining us for this CBE lecture. As Koichi said, this is part 4 of Reverend Dr. Matsumoto's lectures on Shinjin. I think this is a very important subject and sometimes difficult for people to understand. So I really appreciate Reverend Matsumoto doing this for us. So we'll begin today's seminar with Gassho, please. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Reverend Matsumoto. So I'll turn the time over to you. I don't think you need an introduction. Everyone knows who you are. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Hirano, and thank you to everyone in CBE, Koichi and Judy, and thank you also to Reverend Harada for allowing me to take part in today's seminar. As Reverend Hirano mentioned, this is the 4th part of a 4-part talk on Shinjin. I don't know how many of you have lasted the whole time. If you have, I really, let me just express my admiration to you. That's a lot to have to sit through. But I do appreciate this opportunity to share some thoughts and some reflections on this very, very important topic. So today is the final session. So my hope is that I won't blab on too long and that I'll be able to have enough time at the end of the talk for Q&A or for discussion. So let me just move ahead without further ado, and I'm going to share my screen. So this is today's topic, Shinjin, once again, I'm very grateful to be able to take part in this lecture, this series. As Koichi mentioned, these talks are on the BCA CBE YouTube channel. Just as a brief review, the first part, we covered the nature of Shinjin and the arising of Shinjin. Part 2, we covered implications of Shinjin, and the topic that I wanted to reflect on, which I called Exposure and Embrace, a Life of Shinjin. And then part 3, which took place a couple months ago, we looked at Shinjin and birth. And today, the final part, we're going to take up the topic of Shinjin and skillful means. Let me just give you a brief review of parts 1 and 2, if I may. Shinjin, in Shinran's thought, evokes a broad range of religious meaning, from a simple faith in the Amida Buddha's vow to an ever-deepening experience of awakening within the unfolding of wisdom as compassion in our lives. And ultimately, it's none other than the fulfillment of the Buddha's vow mind itself. As we awaken to the ongoing activity of enlightenment, in which wisdom unfolds as compassion for the sake of foolish suffering beings, we also truly know that Amida Buddha's vow mind is fulfilled in each instance of the arising of Shinjin in the world. The Buddha's vow mind becomes fulfilled when we are exposed and emptied, even as we find ourselves embraced and enabled to live with a deep sense of interconnectedness and gratitude for all existences. The arising of Shinjin is the arising of wisdom, realized as we are exposed within the Buddha's light. Our false claims to independence, agency, ableness, and omnipotence are exposed and emptied within the light. It is exactly in that emptying that there arises the possibility of being able to know ourselves and live genuine lives. And at the same time, we are embraced and enabled to live our individual and communal lives. Shinran's teaching of Shinjin is presented within the context of the true and real path of enlightenment, true teaching, practice, Shinjin, realization, and true Buddha and land. Moreover, his understanding of true and real Shinjin is given even more texture through his description of its contrast to and connection with provisional paths to birth. This is what we're going to talk about today. So I'd like to first talk about upaya, or skillful means. Upaya is a Sanskrit word. It's also a Pali word. It's been translated variously into Chinese and Japanese, for the most part as hoben, or Chinese as fangbian. The Sanskrit word upaya means device, expedient, strategy, or means. In a general sense, upaya is a reference to an expedient or provisional teaching or form of teaching that is designed to draw a person toward the true teaching with effectiveness. This is what we call in Japanese gonke hoben. In other words, this expedient teaching is to be accepted and followed or understood temporarily. It is then something to be discarded as one turns and enters the next gate or stage of religious maturity. Upaya in this generic sense has made its way into the English vernacular. We sometimes hear people say with a wink, well, it's just upaya, And upaya is sometimes taken to mean a little white lie, like when we tell children that Santa Claus will know if they've been naughty or nice. Of course, to say so is to lie, but it's an expedient lie in which the end justifies the means. Buddhist thought, however, offers a much broader perspective to this generic and often misused notion of upaya. Another form that we see in the text of upaya is upaya kausalya, which is translated as hoben zengyo, or as zengyo hoben in Japanese. In addition to the generic meaning of expedient means or provisional means, the term also takes on the meaning of skill in devices, or skill in means, or skill in expedients. As the extraordinary pedagogical skills of the Buddhas and advanced bodhisattvas, it is one of the 10 perfections, the paramita, of the bodhisattva path. From the Mahayana standpoint, in particular, skillful means becomes an expression or manifestation of the Buddha's wisdom and compassion, which is directed to the emancipation of beings living within the conditions of the world. We'll talk about this more later. As such, it has been said that skillful means, upaya, is the key that unlocks Buddhism as a living religion. It identifies Buddhism as a religious path that exists and functions in the lives of actual human beings. The concept of skillful means was present in the early narratives of Gautama Buddha's decision to teach the Dhamma after first having attained enlightenment. The Mahavagga of the Vinaya Pitaka and other texts in the Pali Canon is a story in which the Buddha, having just attained enlightenment, comes to teach the way to enlightenment. But he wasn't so inclined initially. In fact, he was inclined not to teach the Dhamma to others because he felt it was too profound and so far beyond the capacities of ordinary beings to hear and to understand, let alone practice. But the Brahma king, Sahampati, implored the Buddha to allow beings to hear the Dhamma. And the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, thereupon looked upon all of the worlds and perceived a whole variety of beings in all states of inclinations, attachments, and abilities, much like the lotus plants are rising at various levels from the muddy waters. And so he realized that the Dhamma could be taught in a variety of ways, and he thereupon taught the Dhamma to the 5 ascetics. This is known as the turning of the wheel of the Dharma. The Lotus Sutra reframes this narrative by placing focus on the importance of teaching as skillful means employed by the Buddha. And the Lotus Sutra really focuses heavily on this notion of hoben, upaya. Because, according to the sutra, ultimate enlightenment cannot be expressed or comprehended immediately by ignorant beings. And so the Buddha's skillful means is essential for beings to be able to hear and to understand and practice the Dharma. In the Alagadu-panna Sutta, there is the famous simile of a raft. The Buddha compares his teachings to a makeshift raft that will enable a person to cross a raging river and reach the other shore. There, the raft will have served its purpose and may abandon. In that way, then, teachings enable one to reach the other shore of nirvana because they are an expedient, and once they have served their purpose, they may then be abandoned. That's the early notion of upaya, as skillful means. Another feature of skill in means is that the Buddha fashions different versions of the teachings to fit the abilities and aptitudes of his followers in a manner most appropriate to them. In addition, upaya has also been given to polemical use in Buddhist history. The Lotus Sutra, for instance, provides that the earlier teachings, such as those of the three vehicles, were merely expedients that the Buddha employed to instruct disciples who were unable to comprehend the more profound teaching of the one vehicle, the ekayana of Buddhahood. The most noted example of this idea, upaya, is found in the parable of the burning house. I'm sure you're all familiar with that story. There's a man who had three children who were playing in a house. He was outside of the house and he realized that the house was on fire, and he was trying to lure the children out of the house, but they wouldn't respond to his calls. And so he told them to look here. There's a cart drawn by a deer. Here's a cart drawn by a goat. Here's a cart drawn by a cow. And since the children were very fascinated by these kinds of things, they then ran out of the house to play with these three carts. And when they got outside, they realized that the three carts didn't exist. There was one single cart driven by an ox. And this story, this parable, is often cited as a way of presenting the idea that somehow the Mahayana teaching of the Lotus Sutra is far superior to those of the three vehicles. But I think it can also be seen within the context of the sutra as a teaching of skillful means, of how the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas present the teachings, present the Dharma to beings in a manner in which they can hear and comprehend and understand and practice the teachings. According to the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism, it says this: the concept of skillful means may thus also be deployed as a hermeneutical or polemic device to critique earlier and implicitly inferior formulations of Buddhist doctrine as expedient teachings given to those who are temporarily incapable of understanding and benefiting from the Buddha's more advanced teachings, as variously identified by different schools. And that's the sort of notion that we've seen, that in many ways, upaya, or skillful means, has often been used in this sense. However, moving on, Michael Pye writes in his, I think, I'm sorry, for some reason, Siri just likes to intrude into our session today. I'm not sure why.
We don't hear it on our end though.
You don't hear? Yeah, it's very loud in my earphones, and so I just have to turn it off. But my apologies for that. So in Mahayana Buddhism, all of the various forms of Buddhist teaching and practice are declared to be provisional means, all skillfully set up by the Buddha for the benefit of the unenlightened. So it's a much broader sense then. So skillful means now is taken to include all the various forms of Buddhist teachings and practices. Skillful means are elaborated in detail in the Lotus Sutra, which explains that the Buddha uses innumerable devices to lead living beings along and to separate them from their attachments. Once again, citing Michael Pye's, I think, very helpful, very instructive text, Skillful Means, a concept in Mahayana Buddhism. Pye also mentions that the great bodhisattvas as well as the Buddhas, through penetrating insight into the true nature of reality, deploy a range of methods for the salvation of beings in accord with the relative ignorance, attachments, and unique needs of each being, while always having the intention of turning beings to nirvana. At the same time, skillful means is also taken and discussed from the side of the sentient beings who require them. That is, from the perspective of sentient beings ceaselessly ensnared in endless rounds of birth and death, samsara. So skillful means, upaya, again, is a discussion point from not only the standpoint of the Buddha, but also from the perspective of sentient beings. And then Pai suggests, and we'll talk about this in a more focused fashion in just a little while. In Mahayana Buddhism, therefore, skillful means involves a paradox. They constantly proliferate as the means to the salvation of beings, and yet at the same time, they move toward their own dissolution and abandonment by beings. And so that's sort of the sense of the bonfire burning on ice, okay? That the ice will put out the bonfire, even as it melts, as the bonfire melts the ice. So there's this situation with skillful means, as I'll talk about. They have a spiritual shelf life. We'll discuss this in more detail. So in Shinran's thought, skillful means, or hoben, is presented, again, within the context of provisional paths to birth to the Pure Land, birth in the Pure Land. That topic, moreover, has usually been characterized by Shin scholars as in terms of his scheme for the classification of all teachings into the true, provisional, and false. So we find in Shinran's writing that sort of analysis or breakdown of all Buddhist teachings, the true, provisional, and false. For the most part, the true path to enlightenment, the teaching practice, Shinjin realization, Buddha body and Buddha land, they are in all aspects true and real. And here Shinran cites the Nirvana Sutra to, in a sense, state that the foundation for the notion of true in Shin Buddhism can be found in Tathagata, that the Tathagata is true, Shunyata, boundless space is true, Buddha nature is true. That's the level of truth in which, and the level at which truth is discussed in Shin Buddhism. In contrast, provisional paths all include all Dharma gates in Shinran's thinking, that skillfully guide beings to birth. And for Shinran, these include all the traditional Mahayana and Pure Land paths. As he says, the term provisional refers to those of the path of sages and those of the meditative and non-meditative practices within the Pure Land path. But Shinran also notes that both the true and provisional are fulfilled from the ocean-like vow of great compassion. We know, therefore, that both are fulfilled Buddha and land. That is, provisional teachings, provisional Buddhas, provisional lands, all of those aspects of the Buddhist path are also the manifestations of wisdom and compassion of the Buddha. And then finally, false. The false paths are set forth by Shinran in a variety of ways. For the most part, he offers a variety of terms to express false teachings: the non-Buddhist teaching, non-Buddhist path, false views, beliefs, practices, false gods, evil spirits, etc., maras, spirits and gods. The common feature of all of these non-Buddhist teachings and false views is that they serve to aggrandize and affirm the working of our egocentricity and ego attachment. Moreover, they advocate that we become dependent on the power of another. There are some people who look at Shinran very superficially and say, oh, he says all non-Buddhist teachings are false, therefore Christianity, Islam, Judaism must all be false. It's non-Buddhist. That's a serious misunderstanding and misreading of Shinran, something that I'd like to take up a little while in the latter part of today's talk. Anyway, Shinran also presents this overall perspective of the Pure Land path, and he outlines them in terms of the 6 features of the 3 Pure Land paths. In the interest of time, I won't go over all of these in details, but you can see the left-hand column, you see the features: the vow, sutra, Dharma gate, Dharma storehouse, beings, and birth. And then we see in this, going from left to right, the provisional path of sundry, various and sundry practices with self-power, and then the provisional path of saying the name with self-power, and finally, the true essence of the Pure Land Way, Jodo Shinshu, the working of other power. And if you can maybe come back to this, you want to do a screen capture or take a look at this when it's on YouTube, you can see that in Shinran's writings and texts, we see a very clear distinction and analysis and a sort of a breakdown of these three Pure Land paths in terms of the 6 features. Okay. In addition, Shinran also has presented what is come to be called his critical classification of Buddhist teachings, Kyoso Hanjaku. Here, it appears in a number of texts in a number of fashions. They're very complex, very lengthy, so I didn't quote them. What I've given you here is a sort of image that I think gives us a better idea, or I think kind of a way of understanding Shinran's classification in a way that's a little easier to understand. If you can see, there's on the very left-hand column, you see there's 2 aspects or two levels of teachings. The first is the path of sages, which Shinran also equates with difficult practice. And then below is the Pure Land path, which he equates with easy practice. Then on the top 2 columns, there's the gradual attainment, and then there's a sudden attainment. And so then when we work all these together, we have 2 pairs of binary possibilities leading to sort of these 4 possible aspects of the Buddhist teachings. And the lower right-hand quadrant, the southeast quadrant, is something he calls transcending crosswise, which is a reference to the true essence of the Pure Land Way. Again, I won't go through all this in detail. It takes some time. If you'd like to do a screen capture, now is a good time, or if you want to take a look at this later on. If anyone has a specific interest in this topic, I'll be very happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Moving on, another dialectic that Shinran utilizes in terms of talking about skillful means is his notion of the explicit and implicit meanings of the contemplation and contemplation sutra and the Amida Sutra. Here, Shinran uses this distinction between explicit and implicit. Explicit, he says, basically pertains to the superficial, the apparent meaning of a sutra. As you read the sutra, what does the sutra say on its face? For Shinran says, for both the Contemplation Sutra and the Amida Sutra, they refer to paths of practice grounded upon self-power. Okay. Implicit, however, means that both sutras have an inner meaning, not hidden so much, but an inner meaning, an inner quality in which they both present in this implicit way the support for the teaching of other power, of Jodo Shinshu. That's the essential notion of the explicit and implicit meanings of the Contemplation Sutra. Now, if you're interested in this, we can certainly talk about this again. There are some areas that are somewhat, I think, problematic or perhaps need to be discussed at greater length. But I think it's clearly one of Shinran's ways of trying to grapple with this interconnection and relationship between these paths, Pure Land paths to birth. Finally, in this section, I just wanted to mention something called Sangan Tenyu, which is a process of religious transformation. And probably one of the most well-known passages in the final chapter, the 6th chapter of Shinran's principal work. This is the chapter on transformed Buddha bodies and Buddha lands in his true teaching, practice, and realization, is one in which he relates his own religious life. He described his path of transformation in terms of a framework known as Sangan Tenyu, literally 3 vows, turn and enter. And in this passage, he relates how he underwent a process of turning and entering within 3 religious realities. There was first the reality, the path of the 19th vow, which we saw earlier. This is birth in a transformed land through various and sundry practices grounded upon the mind of self-power. And then he turned from that path and entered the path of the 20th vow, which is the birth in the transformed land through the self-power practice of the Nembutsu. But then once again, he turned away from, abandoned that path, and turned and entered the path of the 18th vow, birth in the true fulfilled land through entrusting in Amida Buddha's directing of virtue to beings. So this is the passage. It's a very lengthy one. I won't read the passage, but it does set out a narrative of his own spiritual journey, his own religious path as a Pure Land Buddhist. And it's sort of interesting as we read this to try to read it in parallel with those aspects of his life that we believe we're familiar with. His time as a priest on Mount Hiei, the possible practices he engaged in then, his leaving the mountain, his encounter with Honen and the teaching of the Nembutsu, and then the exile of Honen, Shinran, and other followers of the Jodoshu, the Pure Land school, and Shinran's awakening, as he says in his major work in 1201. He entrusts himself to the universal vow, of other power. And so it's sort of interesting if we can sort of look at these in parallel. Another interesting facet of this this passage and Shinran's narrative is how it's been treated in historical studies of Shin Buddhism. For the most part, the accepted interpretation accepted by Orthodox authorities in Nishi Honganji is this is a historical narrative. Shinran is talking about his life, his own journey in his own way, but it's not saying that we need to follow the same path. It's not suggesting that we have to become priests in the Tendai school and meet with a teacher like Honen and enter into exile. It's not suggesting that. And in the Orthodox perspective, it's also not suggesting that this is sort of the paradigm for a path of practice, that we have to go through various stages. That's the sort of accepted interpretation of the notion of this Sangan Tenyu passage. But just to let you know, there are a range of other interpretations, some of which see this as Shinran's not only his own personal narrative, but perhaps a model in a broader sense for a narrative of spiritual search and journey. There's also another way of looking at this is in terms of the activity of skillful means, how Shinran's engagement with the path of the 19th vow, the path of the 20th vow, were in his engagement with the teachings and the practices set out in a way that were that appealed to him at that time in his life. He engaged in these practices as true practices, as true teachings, until they weren't, until they began to show their own limitations, as he began to become aware of his own limitations. And so in this path, this unfolding path of skillful means, he then was guided to the path of the 18th vow. And so some people see this as a paradigm for this type of spiritual journey, one that perhaps we as well might consider or look upon as a model as well in our own lives. And so there are a variety of interpretations of this passage. I just wanted to let you know, something we can certainly talk about again, if you like, at the end of this talk. Just in the general sense, if I can just return to the idea of upaya as Buddha activity of skillful means, Shinran's writing reveals that he was quite aware of this, as this notion of upaya as Buddha activity. It can also be gleaned from his work that he gave the notion of skillful means a uniquely Pure Land Buddhist spin by placing the theoretical foundation for the efficacy of upaya in the idea of the interpenetration of Dharma body as suchness and Dharma body as compassionate means. This is something that we've raised in other talks, and I think a lot of you have are aware of this in your study of Shin Buddhism. Let me just go over it again, if I may. In Shinran's major work, in the chapter on true realization, he cites passages from a commentary written by Tanwan, a Pure Land master of China. And Tanwan, in his work, presents this theory of two kinds of Dharma body, Dharma kaya. He says there's the Dharma body as suchness, hosho hoshing, literally Dharma nature, Dharma body, and Dharma body as compassionate means, hoben hoshing, literally upaya Dharma body. This is the passage from Tanwan's commentary in Shinran's work. If we look at it in a broad sense, what this theory of the two Dharma bodies presents is this notion: the Dharma body as suchness, as Shinran says, has neither color nor form. Thus, the mind cannot grasp it, nor words describe it. By its very nature, Dharma body as suchness is Dharma nature, it's Buddha nature. It's beyond our capacity to conceptualize, to express, to conceive, or to perceive. And so this is the nature of enlightenment. By its very nature, it transcends and surpasses our own conceptual understanding, our own discriminative consciousness. And therefore, it's taken to be formless and colorless. But that's not the only nature of enlightenment. At the same time, the Dharma body becomes the Dharma body as compassionate means, hoben hoshing, or literally the upaya Dharma body. And here Shinran describes it in this way: from this oneness was manifested form, called Dharma body as compassionate means. As he says, this is none other than Amida Buddha. So if enlightenment and truth was simply Dharma body as suchness, and colorless and formless, something we can't conceive or express or experience, what good is it sitting out there in the universe somewhere feeling good about itself? But that's not the nature of enlightenment. Enlightenment, because it is formless, it manifests form, and it manifests all manner of forms. In Shinran's particular, he says it manifests the form of name and light. As he says here, compassionate means refers to manifesting form, revealing a name, and making itself known to beings. It refers to Amida Buddha. He says this Tathagata is also light. Light is none other than wisdom. Wisdom is the form of light. Wisdom is, in addition, formlessness. So formlessness, formless enlightenment, suchness, Dharma nature, Dharma body, gives rise to form. Why? So that the form can be manifested and revealed to sentient beings, so it can be made known to sentient beings. It manifests as name, as light. Okay, the name for us to hear, Namo Amida Butsu, the light that illumines and surrounds us and exposes us and embraces us. So this development of the notion of skillful means in Shinran's thought must be seen in the context of his perspective on Amida Buddha's vow mind, or perhaps in the Buddha's calculated and skilled methodology in bringing beings to birth. In explicit sense, therefore, the provisional teachings do not present the true Pure Land path. That's what Shinran taught us in his dialectic of the explicit and implicit teachings. However, he says, implicitly, that in their inner meaning, they're intended to reveal the working of the vow, which acts to bring about a fundamental transformation of insight and religious experience. That's the notion of provisional teachings. That's the function of skillful means. For Shinran, the notion of hoben includes, but also indicates something much more than expediency. So it's more than just the expedient teachings or provisional teachings. It doesn't just refer to teachings, concepts, or symbols that can be temporarily used and then later discarded as untrue. It involves more than mere intellectual discrimination or willful choice or calculation on the part of beings. Instead, hoben, in and of itself, refers to the compassionate activity of the Buddha. The Buddha's skillful means, the word is Zengyo Hoben, which is calculated to lead ignorant beings along a path of deepening and maturing religious experience. Okay, so in that sense, for Shinran, then the working of the Buddha, the wisdom unfolding as compassion, takes the form of the function of skillful means of Zengyo Hoben, calculated to lead ignorant beings along the path of deepening. And we as sentient beings receive and adopt and employ these means as expediency, as provisional teachings and provisional practices. A being possessed of the mind of self-power, that is calculation or doubt, etc., might initially accept a provisional path as his or her own true path, and therefore pursue it wholeheartedly. So I think this is something that we need to emphasize in this path of skillful means. Sometimes we look at it globally, or we take a big, broad view and we say, oh, provisional path, of course, it's only temporary. It's not neither true nor false. But for a person who is engaged in this path, a person who comes upon, for instance, the Pure Land path of meditation or contemplation or saying the name, for that person who engages that path and adopts that path, those teachings and practices are true. They are meaningful. They speak to this person. They have significance. They have a value. If it were not so, that person wouldn't engage that path. And so we have to understand that when in the path of skillful means, when I undertake these paths that we might call paths of self-practice, for me, this is it. This is the real way. This is the path to the Pure Land for me. However, as a product of the Buddha's skilled calculation, this provisional path is in the process of a sort of a skillfully planned obsolescence. That's my terminology, by the way. Shinran doesn't use that kind of terminology. The path begins to reveal its limitations, even as the depth of the practicer's blind passions and self-attachment also become revealed with the practicer's experience of failure and frustration. So as I continue to engage in these paths of practices, as I run up against obstructions or difficulties or failure, it's not only my failure, but it's all in frustration, but it's also the provisional path itself, revealing its own self-limitations. And thus it reveals its untruth, its limitations, as well as the practicer's untruth, my deep self-attachment. As it does so, the true import of the provisional path will be revealed, and it will realize its fulfillment as it moves the practicer beyond itself to the true path of other power. This is the function of skillful means. This is the function of a provisional path. Michael Pai says, in Mahayana Buddhism, therefore, skillful means involves a paradox, as we said before. The teachings constantly proliferate as the means to the salvation of beings, and yet at the same time, they move toward their own dissolution and abandonment as their very nature. That's the nature of skillful means. They have a spiritual shelf life. Here we're reminded of the Huayan Sutra, the chapter on the entry into the realm of reality, in which the young man Sudana journeys to learn the way of the Bodhisattvas from multiple spiritual teachers. And in the chapter, each time Sudana goes to a different teacher, it could be a monk, could be a mendicant, could be a business person, could be a courtesan, could be a teacher, could be anybody, and that person teaches Sudana the way of the Bodhisattva as best that they can. But at the final moment of their relationship, the teacher says, that's all I've got. That's all I can teach you. I can go no further. I encourage you to go see so-and-so. And the person will name someone who will teach you further the way of the Bodhisattva. That sort of orientation then of skillful means, provisional means, coming to the end of its usefulness. And in a sense, just as the practitioner turns about and enters a new path, the the path of skillful means turns about and encourages the practicer to go ahead on their own path. Therefore, provisional Buddhist paths are explicitly self-limiting, untrue, and therefore implicitly self-transcending as true. Okay. Moving on, skillful means in Shinran's thought can also be considered within the contours of Shinjin and birth. And this was the topic of our lecture. I had lecture 4, actually it should be lecture 3, pardon me. Just a brief review of lecture 3. I think it can be summarized in this paragraph as I look back on it. As in our reading of the world within Shinran's text, this leads us to understand that in Shinran's thought, 1, we realize the immediate attainment of birth, sokutoku ojo, here and now, in the one thought moment of Shinjin, when we hear the name, and we attain supreme nirvana as we realize birth in the true fulfilled land after death. I think those two ideas, perspectives are raised by Shinran. I want to move on now, if we could, because for the most part, in our last session, in part 3, we really stayed in the world within the text. And as I mentioned before in the previous parts, we're sort of following along on the hermeneutical approach of Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher. He talks about the 3 worlds of the text. Again, to review, there is what he calls the world behind the text. That's the historical, the cultural, societal context within which the author composed the text. There's the world within the text, the structure, the language, the genre, terms and translations and syntax of the text itself. We look deeply within the text. What does it say? How does it say it? And then there's another world, the world in front of the text. That's our own perspective, the reader's perspective, the reader's needs and biases, concerns, the reader's context as well. And so Ricoeur says, when we engage a text, we engage the text within all 3 worlds, sometimes simultaneously, often simultaneously, sometimes emphasizing one or the other. In the last session, part 3, we really emphasized the world within the text. I'd like to kind of move outside of that if I can. So right now, I'd like to explore the world behind the text, the world within the text, and the world in front of the text, as we look more deeply into the connection between Shinjin, birth, and skillful means. First of all, let's go to the world behind Shinran's text. In his text, Gutokusho, or Gutoku's notes, Shinran expresses the following. It says this: concerning the entrusting of oneself to the primal vow, to borrow the words of Shandao, in the preceding moment, life ends. And he puts in a footnote, this means that one immediately enters the group of the truly settled, citing Tanwan. And then Shinran says, concerning immediately attaining birth, to borrow the words of Shandao, in the next moment, you are immediately born. And then he says, this means that one immediately enters the stage of the definitely settled, citing Nagarjuna. Further, he says, one is termed a definitely settled bodhisattva. What Shinran is doing here is very interesting. Sort of like the other entries into this text, Gutoku's notes, is very pithy, very summarized, and sometimes very hard to understand. What Shinran is doing here, he's doing some interesting things. First of all, he uses this phrase, entrusting oneself to the primal vow. In a sense, he's drawing this language from the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow in the largest sutra. Okay, that one sentient being hear the name, realizing even one thought moment of Shinjin and joy. Okay, and they aspire to be born in the Pure Land. This moment of entrusting oneself to the Pure Land, to the primal vow, he then equates. He brings in the working of Shandao, the Pure Land master from China, who, in his interpretation of that passage of the fulfillment of the 18th vow, he says, in the preceding moment, life ends. Okay. Now, for Shandao, if we look back in his text, he takes this very literally. He's saying, one entrusts in the primal vow, at the end of life, one dies. In the moment before that one dies. This is before death. In that previous moment, one entrusts in the vow, and then life ends. Okay, saying in a very literal, physical sense. But Shinran, taking those words, entrusting oneself to the primal vow, and then borrowing the words of Shandao, who said in the preceding moment, life ends in a very physical sense. Shinran then brings into the conversation the words of Tanwan. One immediately enters the group of the truly settled. And if you remember from last session, part 3, Shinran took this idea up at great length. And he says, basically, Shinran also cited Tanwan at that time. He said, this means that the person of Shinjin immediately, without a day passing, without any time passing, immediately and instantly enters the stage of the truly settled here and now in this life. So for Shinran then, he takes this notion that in trusting in the vow, one enters immediately into the stage of the truly settled. And then he takes this next passage concerning immediately attaining birth. This is also from the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow. He again borrows words from Shandao. In the next moment, you are immediately born. And as before, Shandao's use of the terms mean, you say the Nembutsu, our life comes to an end. In the next moment, we're born in the Pure Land. That's what Shandao said. Shinran, however, takes this and he then applies the words of Nagarjuna. One immediately enters the stage of the definitely settled, very similar to what we saw above, once again indicating that this is something that occurs immediately, instantaneously in this life, here and now. And he goes on to say, one is a definitely settled bodhisattva. So this is another way of looking at this very spare, very simple sort of passage in Gotoku's notes. But looking at the world behind the text, we understand that there's a great history in historical context that Shinran brings into this conversation. Shigari Sensei interprets this passage in this way. He says, entrusting oneself to the primal vow means that in the preceding moment, one's false and deluded life come to an end. Immediately attaining birth, Sokotoku Ojo, means that accordingly, one is immediately born into the new life of the Tathagata in the very next moment, that one experiences a spiritual death and a spiritual birth, immediately being born into a new life of the Tathagata. This is that sense of experiencing a spiritual death, a spiritual birth here and now. That's another way of looking at Shinran's passage, again, looking at it from the world behind the text, and also, I think, the world within and in front of the text. Because here, as Shigari Sensei interprets it, I think we get this sense that he draws upon his own life experiences when he says, as we awaken to the dynamic working of compassionate wisdom in our lives, we come to discard our old skin of arrogance, calculation, doubt, and pride, and little by little, step by step, we find ourselves born to our new selves, able to move ahead on our life paths without fear or obstruction, here and now. So this is another way of understanding Shinran's perspective on birth, on Shinjin, and ultimately on skillful means. Another set of thoughts that I want to share with you is this. This is from the letter of Eshinni, okay, the Eshinni Monjo, the letters of Eshinni, in which Eshinni writes about her husband, Shinran. And she says this in one of the letters. Right away, he set out at dawn in search of the cause for his salvation in the afterlife and encountered Master Honen. So here clearly, Eshinni is writing about those events that occurred when Shinran left Mount Hiei. Okay, and he went in search for the Master Honen. This is probably after his 100-day, or actually 95-day vigil at Rokkakudo. But here she says his motivation was his salvation in the afterlife. This clearly was on Shinran's mind. That's what drove him. This was his ultimate religious concern, sort of encouraging him, motivating him to go encounter the Master Honen. And then she says later, as for the matter of the afterlife, the teaching given by his Master Honen which he accepted with assurance, was that for both good and evil persons alike, there is but a single path upon which one can depart from birth and death. There's a single path upon which one can depart from birth and death. In Japanese, this is known as shoji izubeki michi. These are the words of Eshinni. If we sort of, again, maybe take a step away from the text and think about Shinran's life, it might be said, if we learn from these words of Eshinni, is that in the early years of his life, until he met Honen and joined the Nembutsu movement at Yoshimizu, birth and death represented the Saha realm of impermanence, suffering, and pain. And Shinran's religious concern was to find a way to depart from it in order to realize salvation in the afterlife. Upon encountering Honen, he realized a spiritual birth, or what we might say a spiritual death and a spiritual birth. Okay, he said and he heard the Nembutsu, he entrusted in the vow, he attained non-retrogression and entered into the ranks of the truly settled, much in the same way that he might have reflected upon in those passages in Gotoku's notes. And it might be said that his focus shifted from that of salvation in the afterlife to awakening to the activity of Amida Buddha's vow mind, the unfolding of wisdom as compassion that exposed his falsity and karmic evil within the light of wisdom and embraced him, a foolish, ordinary being filled with deluded passions within the Buddha's heart of unbounded compassion. So as he met Honen and said the Nembutsu, heard the Nembutsu, he underwent a change, a transformation in his spiritual journey. Thus, we see a corresponding shift in his perspective on life and death in his major texts. Although birth and death remain for Shinran an expression of the Saha world of impermanence, delusion, foolishness, ignorance, and suffering, at the same time, he also offered the notion of birth and death within the context of the identity of samsara and nirvana, now moving into the more Mahayana perspectives on our existence in samsara, where he says, just as an example, unhindered means to know that birth and death is itself nirvana. Such dharma gates as this one teaching entrance into non-duality reveal the unhinderedness of enlightenment. Okay, so Shinran is now engaging with this notion of birth and death or samsara in a very different way. And then he also says, Amida grasps and protects us with compassionate light so that we part forever from birth and death. So when we realize Shinjin and the practice that is given to us by the vow of Amida, we realize that we will part forever from birth and death. This is also another aspect of his religious journey. And then he's able to say this. This is from one of his letters, a fascinating entry. He says, the heart of the person of Shinjin already and always resides in the Pure Land. Isn't that a fascinating thing to say? The heart of the person of Shinjin already and always resides in the Pure Land. Already means in this life, at this moment, from the moment of the one thought moment of Shinjin, of the awakening, that one resides in the Pure Land, and one will always reside in the Pure Land throughout one's life and after death. I think that sort of perspective is a fascinating one that Shinran presents in this very short sentence in one of his letters. Perhaps what he's saying is Shinjin, as we saw in the last session, that in which he says we had to have attained what one will attain, okay, in the notion of attaining birth, instantly attaining birth, that Shinjin is non-dual. It's not separate from birth in the Pure Land, for both are the fulfillment of the working of Amida's vow, transcending life and death. And then he says, when we reach that lotus-held world, we realize immediately the body of suchness and dharma nature, we attain enlightenment. We realize supreme nirvana. Okay, and then sporting in the forest with blind passions, they manifest transcendent powers. Entering the garden of birth and death, they assume various forms to guide others. So being born in the Pure Land then means to return to the realm of samsara, to teach and guide others. Okay, that's what he also says here. So this sort of, you can see this growing perspective that Shinran has on the notions of life and death, of Shinjin and birth, as he pursues and journeys through and walks upon the path of the Nembutsu. All of this is fascinating, and I think is one of the reasons why Shinran is such a very important and significant figure in the history of Buddhism. But I also want to say this, because as I engage with Shinran in the world within the text, as well as the world in front of the text, it seems to me that that very same Shinran, the very same person, also lived in a world of human companionship, a family, in impermanence and separation and loss. Even as he was able to write, and I'm sure think about and realize the depth of the Mahayana insight very, very deeply, at the same time, he lived in the human world. He had friends and family. He realized loss and separation and permanence. And I believe that that world, the human world, was also a reality to him. And so that the Buddha's teaching of a realm of peace and bliss was able to function as a skillful means that offered comfort and assurance to Shinran and his friends in their final years of life. For instance, he writes this also in a letter: "My life has now reached the fullness of its years. It is certain that I will go to birth in the Pure Land before you, so without fail, I will await you there." He writes this to an old friend that he knew up in the Kanto area before he left for Kyoto. And this is these are the final words of this letter. And you can see here, this is a letter written to a friend, a good old friend, but a person who maybe he hasn't seen for a long time. And they both have gotten on in years. They know that their journey of life is about to come to an end. As he says, "My life has now reached the fullness of its years." And he says, "I am certain that I will go to birth in the Pure Land before you. So without fail, I will await you there." Isn't that an interesting thing to say? For a person who also equated birth in the Pure Land with Buddhahood, with realizing and attaining supreme nirvana, of becoming one with suchness, of knowing Buddha nature, and then returning to the garden and forest of samsara to aid and teach beings. Here he says, "I'll wait for you there. I'll wait for you in the Pure Land. I'll see you there, old friend." Okay, it's the same Shinran. And some might say, "Oh, he just wrote it. He didn't really mean it. He's just writing to comfort an old friend." Or maybe someone says he's kind of old, so maybe he didn't know what he's writing. I don't think either of those statements are true. I think it's the very same Shinran, the very same person who's writing and speaking from the depth of his Shinjin. I often say this: the Jodo Shinshu tradition is a big tent. What I mean by that is that there's room for everyone. Persons of all ages, genders, races, backgrounds, and points of view. There's room for philosophers and scientists, religious zealots, as well as just regular folks who are trying to be good Buddhists and want to be with their loved ones again in the Pure Land in the life to come. There's room for everybody. There's room for all of those views. There's room for all of those perspectives. Our wishes, our ideas, our wishes, our aspirations for birth in a Pure Land or a heaven or an afterlife are living religious phenomena within our human lives. For us, they're real, they're true. I believe that in Shinran's perspective on skillful means, these thoughts and feelings, again, maybe I use the wrong word, are neither true nor false, but they're real, okay? And so the provision of Pure Land teaching of a land of utmost bliss is skillful means. It speaks directly to the concrete reality within which we live, and that gives our lives direction, meaning, and hope. Wisdom arises as compassion, and it functions as skillful means of enlightenment. It understands and addresses our wishes, our aspirations, our ideas, our expectations of birth and the afterlife. The provisional teaching takes on the form of truth reality that in our lives. It's not false or simply dualistic or unsophisticated. It's not inferior to the profound insights of Mahayana philosophy, nor is it a pre-scientific view or an illogical perspective. The real, the sense, I will see her again in the Pure Land. I will see him again in the Pure Land. That's a statement of reality. That's the reality of skillful means in human life. It's a profound expression of enlightenment, of discriminative wisdom, prajna paramita, unfolding as compassion skillfully within a human heart, opening that heart up to the Buddha, wishing to be born, wishing to walk the path of the Nembutsu. I remember when meeting with a good friend. She was an older person that I'd known in the Twin Cities, and she moved out to San Jose after her husband passed away. I remember I went to visit her in her apartment near the San Jose Betsuin, and we had a wonderful conversation. She was this wonderful person. And I remember I was studying at IBS and learning all this very profound Mahayana stuff, studying at that time probably the Huayan Sutra, and thinking I was getting close to a profound understanding of the Buddhist teachings. And she said to me, I'm going to be with my husband again. Simply like that. Simply, clearly, honestly, humbly. And that statement, I think, was every bit as profound as any of those great Mahayana doctrines that I was studying or the teachers were trying to impart. I'm going to be with my husband again in the Pure Land. We're going to be together again. That sense, I think, spoke of the truth of the Dharma, the truth and the effectiveness of skillful means. For her, this was real. Who's to say that it was not? Who's to say that she's unsophisticated or uneducated? Her insight was profound and deep and real. I think it was one of the most beautiful statements of Buddhism that I'd ever heard in my life. In the second part of our Shinjin series, I mentioned this, that I try to sort of use this as a way of getting a sense of what's going on in Shin Buddhism. Because of the light, we can see the dust. Because of the light of the Dharma, we can see the dust. It's not because of the dust we can see the light, which might be the perspective of another Buddhist tradition, but because of the light, we can see the dust. So in part 2 of these talks, I suggested that Shin Buddhism offers a focus on a soteriology of transcendent immanence. What I mean by that is formless Dharma body as suchness gives rise to Dharma body's compassion means it manifests a form of light, as we've just seen. It exposes us in its wisdom illumination and takes a name, Namo Amida Butsu, making itself known to us, enabling us to know ourselves and live authentic lives here and now. That's what I mean by transcendent immanence. However, at this time, and because we're considering Shinran's teaching and our understanding, our appreciation of the teaching of Shinjin, birth and skillful means, I might rephrase the idea to suggest that our human perspectives of reality are exposed and embraced by the light of the Buddha's skillful means. That which is beyond us draws us beyond ourselves. That our human perspectives of reality, our assurance that we will be born, I will be born before you and I will await you there. I will see my husband again in the Pure Land, both exposed, illuminated, and embraced by the light of the Buddha's skillful means. I have a few stories to tell. I think all of you have stories to tell, but that's a great thing about being at a temple. There's always great stories. Let me just share a few of them with you. One of his goes back to my first year as a minister. Got assigned to a BCA temple, wet behind the ears, and took part in the very first funeral. It was a large funeral. The person was a gentleman who was very well known, very active in the temple community, and everybody came out. And after the funeral, they had an otoki, some meal over in the social hall. And so I went over to the social hall really just to get to know people because I didn't know anybody. So I went over there and was walking around talking to people. And then I came upon this table of men who were laughing and joking, eating and drinking. And one guy at the table was saying, "Oh, it's too bad our friend so-and-so died. Now who's next?" He went around the table. "I think it's you. No, you don't look so good. Oh, I think it's you." And they were going around pointing fingers at each other. "No, it's you. You're the next one to go. You're the next one to go." And they were laughing, at the top of their lungs and having a great old time. And I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I said, "How could you talk like that? This is your friend. This is a funeral. Aren't you supposed to be sad? What's going on here? What kind of Buddhist are you?" But, they kind of looked at me. I didn't really say that out loud, but I was thinking that, but later on, I realized that this goes on all the time. It happens all the time. And that it's very important that it goes on all the time. Because by being able to joke in this way, by being able to say, "Who's next? You're next, you're next, no, you're next," being able to make it something that each of these people could relate to. And each of these people could also have their friend involved in this conversation. This allowed them to talk about death. This allowed them to realize the transient nature of life, that we're all getting old and that we're going to die. We're going to be separated from our friends and those we love. This is a reality that we all face. And they knew it. They accepted it. They embraced it. And their way of dealing with it was to laugh about it and to joke about it. And I came to really, really, I learned a great deal from those gentlemen. And I always appreciate that conversation. Another story, somewhat in the same vein, I remember going to a temple to speak. And at that time, the temple had built a brand new no kotsudo, a columbarium. It's just brand new. The minister took me over there to take a look, and there are a lot of members there. And they had these beautiful niches with glass. The front door was glass, so you could see the urns, and you could see you'll be able to see the names on the plate, on the window of each niche. Just beautiful. And I was looking around, and I came to this one fellow I happened to know. I didn't know a lot of people at the time, but I knew him. We were talking, and I noticed there was a sticker with his name on one of the niches. I go, "Oh, this is your niche." He said, "Yeah, I've reserved this." And I said, "Oh, that's great." Then I looked around a little bit more, and I realized, "Oh, wait a minute now. This is a guy who had 3 sisters." And I looked, "Where are your sisters? Are they here?" And he said, no, their niches are on the other side." I go, "Wait a minute, how come your niche is over here and their niches are over there?" And he looked at me, and he kind of gave me a smile. He said, "Yakamashi," which is Japanese, is they talk all the time. They're noisy. They're going to bother me in my eternal rest. So I don't want to be close to them. Anyway, another way of just sort of laughing at this, but accepting this reality, the reality of death, and the reality, of this transition that we all undergo, but always being a part of a community, this sense that the connections that we have fostered, the connections that we have realized throughout our lives, they don't end at death. And these connections of life continue on in different ways. And I think that's what he was expressing to me in this very humorous way. Just another story, if that's okay. This is a story that I shared with others on other occasions, but it was of a good friend of mine in Stockton. He was a gentleman who I came to know and came to consider to be one of my great Dharma friends. I met him at a time when I was also brand new. He came down to the temple. He was a Caucasian gentleman. I'd never seen him before. He came to the door one day and he knocked on the door, and I introduced myself. He introduced himself, and he said, "Great, I'm glad I came to the temple." And I told him about all of our services, all of our study classes. He said, "Yeah, great, that's wonderful, but I want to study Buddhism." And so I said, "I just kind of told you everything. Let me go over it again." He said, No, I got it. I'll attend everything, but I want to study." And which told me he wanted to start studying Buddhism right away. So I was wet behind the ears. I didn't have anything better to do. So we went to a room, a Dharma school classroom. We opened some books and we started to study. And we studied every week, just the two of us, for months. And during that time, we got a chance to know each other very well. And he told me, when he was comfortable with me, he told me that he had AIDS, or that he earlier in the year he was HIV positive, and that he now had full-blown AIDS. And at the time, of course, that was a death sentence. So he knew he was going to die. And so he said a lot of things that happened in his life. He didn't respond very well. He lost his family. He lost his job. But he really wanted to learn Buddhism. But he also wanted to dance in the Bonodori. And so we talked about that. And he got up the courage to dance Bon, and he loved it. Anyway, make a long story short, we became good friends. But one day he died. He lived in Sacramento, so I went up there to do the Makuragyo. And after the chanting, his roommate gave me 2 shopping bags full of envelopes. One of the bags, when I took it back to Stockton, I looked at it, there were just a bunch of invitations to his funeral, which he had printed out. He said, "You are cordially invited to the funeral of so-and-so, which will take place at the Stockton Buddhist Temple on this date, this time." And he left me instructions. He said, "Find a good date and time, fill it in, and please send these out," which I did. Another bag contained letters, which are mostly sealed, that he had written, and they were addressed to various people. So he asked me to mail them. I did. One of the envelopes was addressed to me, and it took me a while to read it, but when I finally did, I sat down all by myself at night and I read his letter. And basically, just to put it, just to kind of summarize this, he said basically he started studying Buddhism because he knew he was going to die and he wanted to learn how to die. He heard all these stories about samurai and people in Japan who could die bravely. And he said, I wanted to die bravely. And I thought Buddhism would teach me how to die. But he said, after studying Buddhism with you, I realized that Buddhism doesn't teach you how to die. It teaches you how to live. And he said, because of the Buddha's vow, in spite of myself, somehow I come to know myself and to accept myself. And he said, I choose to live. So this is something that, it has great value to me, tremendous value to me. His willingness to share his innermost thoughts, but also, his expressing to me his deepest fears, his deepest hopes, and of how the Dharma, how this teaching, the teaching of skillful means was able to allow him to open up his heart and mind, and to come to choose to live, even in the midst of all of the difficulties and obstructions that he was facing. These are some of the stories I want to share with you. I'm sure many of you have other stories. Perhaps we can share stories at the end of this session. I also want to continue with this train of thought. We live in a religiously plural world. There exists many different religious traditions, each offering a teaching or truth claims about what is good or bad, what is right or wrong, about life and death, and about the afterlife. And there are many, many sacred teachings about this world and the life to come that will overcome death. I'm sorry, what is that? And so in this situation, it's only natural that we might ask a lot of questions. We wonder, after life ends, will I be born in Amita's Pure Land? Do I really know? This is what it's taught, but do I really know? Will it be the true fulfilled land, realize enlightenment immediately, or a transformed land, a womb palace, a city of doubt, a closed lotus blossom? What about a Christian? Will a Christian be born in heaven? Will a Muslim be born in paradise? Will an atheist just disappear into nothingness? All of these concepts and views, are they all the same or are they different? What do we make of this? A lot of questions arise in a time where there are many religions. And so here is my belief as a Shin Buddhist. Let me just state this. This is just my thinking at this moment. If Amida Buddha's universal vow is true and real, then it will be fulfilled when all beings throughout the 10 quarters, without exception, attain supreme nirvana upon realizing birth in the Pure Land. This does not mean, however, that other teachings are false, but at least from the Shin perspective, they're provisional. Okay? All variety of teachings are skillful means that serve to direct us to a reality beyond ourselves. This is a reality that's embodied by our faith, our hopes, and our aspirations. It's a reality that will be experienced as truth as we awaken to our own reality of limitation, finitude, foolishness, evil, and sinfulness. All teachings are skillful means, again. They serve to direct us to a reality beyond ourselves. It's a reality beyond conception, beyond words, beyond explanation, beyond polemics, beyond comparison, beyond orthodoxy or sectarianism, beyond materialism, beyond spiritualism, beyond Christianity, beyond Buddhism, beyond religion. It's a reality that's embodied by our faith, hopes, and aspirations, as I mentioned before. I'd like to tell you another story, and I think it's going to be hard for me to get through this, but I'd like to share some thoughts with you, if I may. Please bear with me. 2 weeks ago, I lost my younger brother to cancer. He had suffered for a very long time. He finally succumbed a couple of weeks ago. He and our older brother and I, we were 3 boys. We were raised in a Protestant Christian family. My younger brother became a devout convert to Catholicism, whereas I became a convert to Buddhism. 1 week ago, I attended his funeral, and during the service, the officiant, the temple priest, delivered a homily about my brother and his faith. And his words, they just pierced my heart. He talked about the fact that my brother and his wife, as well as he, the priest, the 3 of them, they went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I didn't realize at the time, but it was on my brother's bucket list. And so this was kind of near the end of COVID. There weren't a lot of travelers in Israel at the time. So it was just the 3 of them. And they spent a lot of time in the various sites in the old city of Jerusalem in particular. And one of the key moments of their trip was to do a pilgrimage to walk the Via Dolorosa, sometimes called the Way of Sorrows, the Path of Pain, in the old city of Jerusalem. It features the 14 stations of the cross, where the story is that Jesus walked along these steps bearing the cross, finally to be crucified, finally to die, be placed in a tomb. So it's a very special place. It has great significance for all Christians. And I didn't realize until I heard the story that my brother had always dreamed of going there. So the 3 of them went there. And the priest in his homily said their time to go to walk the Via Dolorosa was early morning, about 5 a.m. And it so happened that morning it was really raining, but they went anyway, the 3 of them plus their escort, on that historic walk. You can see part of the walk here on the screen. And the priest said they stopped at each station of the cross to pray, saying, "Lord, this sinner asked to be taken in by your grace. Lord, the sinner asked to be brought into your kingdom." The image that the priest presented in his talk was just so clear and beautiful. I could see my brother. I could see the tears streaming down his face, becoming indistinguishable from the rain falling upon him from the skies, and the water from the ancient streets that soaked his knees as he knelt in prayer. My brother knew he was dying at the time. And he had devoted his final year of life to his family and his friends, giving them support, wishing them well. I was very fortunate that my wife and son and I were able to visit my brother and his family just a few weeks before he died. But most of all, my brother just wanted to be together with his son in heaven. That was his deepest wish. That was his constant prayer. So my brother was a devout Catholic, a person of deep faith. I am a Buddhist minister, but I believe that he and his son are together again in heaven. I believe that despite my education and training, despite really not knowing this reality, not knowing about the ontological reality of a heaven or a pure land or any other realm after life, but I feel it deeply in my heart, and I know it deeply in my heart as well. So my brother and his faith are also serving as skillful means for me in his wish to be together with his son, of his deep faith, his confessing his sins and wishing to be held and taken in by God. I felt each moment of his journey. And in many ways, he has allowed me to reflect upon my own journey of becoming a Buddhist, becoming a minister. Because I realize my journey into Buddhism really began with the very same thoughts. My wife had died, and all I wanted in life was to be together with her. All I wanted in life was to know that she was okay. That was my religious concern. Those were the only questions I had. And I came to IBS to study. I went to Ryukoku to study. I read every book I can get my hands on. There were no answers whatsoever. But somehow, over time, through saying the Nembutsu and hearing the Nembutsu, hearing the name, I came to realize that in fact, she's always with me. I'm always with her. We'll always be together in life and death after death, together with all other beings. So I thank my brother. I thank the priest for his story about him. And I thank you for allowing me to share that with you. One of the 3 Pure Land Sutras is the Amida Sutra. It's the shortest of the sutras. It's one that sometimes we chant in memorial services, and usually we chant at Obon. And one of the passages in the Amida Sutra is a very famous one. It goes like this: Shariputra, sentient beings who hear of that land should aspire to be born there, for in that one place they will be able to meet such excellent persons of supreme virtue. Kue Isho. This is a phrase that we often talk about during Obon, but it's also one that I think serves great importance to us each and every day. As I grow older, and as I lose friends and family members, I've really come to feel the loss very, very keenly. And so these words, Kue Isho, take on new meaning for me as the years go by. The sutra teaches us that one who entrusts in the Buddha's vow receives the assurance of being born in the Pure Land. And in that land, one will meet the Buddha and Bodhisattvas and all the other excellent persons of supreme virtue. This Pure Land, even though it's described in great detail in the sutra, in Shinran's teaching is not a physical place somewhere out in the universe, nor is it a heaven far removed from our present day lives. That's what we gather from his teachings. Rather, it expresses the unlimited breadth and depth of the Buddha's compassionate heart. which reaches out as the primal vow to all beings whose hearts are confused and in pain and filled with delusion. As I was thinking about this talk about Shinjin and skillful means, I come to sense that in these words, the Buddha knew exactly about the longing that's in our hearts today. I believe he knows that we are asking, could these excellent persons also include our loved ones who have passed away before us and whom we long to meet again? As we think about, as we continue to listen to and savor this teaching, could it not be that we sense that that one place, the Isho, lies within the oneness of the Buddha's heart? And in that one place, we will meet them once again in the truest and most authentic way. Kue Isho. The Amida Sutra teaches us that persons of Shinjin will certainly meet the excellent persons of the Pure Land. And as we entrust in the compassionate vow of the Buddha, we encounter its powerful activity and hear its voice, Namo Amida Butsu. This vow brings us together here and now within the oneness of the Buddha's heart and the Buddha's land. In this timeless moment, this encounter with Amida's vow, we encounter our true selves and that learn we can live authentic lives together with all others. Entering into the Buddha's compassionate heart, we come to understand the unsurpassed value of the lives of all persons who have passed away before us, as well as those still living within infinite life. We're allowed to meet all of those excellent persons, not just at some other place or some other time, but in this place, at this one moment now and forever. Within the Nembutsu, we experience this one true meeting, this precious and joyful moment of eternal life. Kue Isho, I believe, represents the working of Amida's vow in this world and in the world to come. So, thank you for allowing me to share these stories. What do we make of them? Am I saying that all religions are the same? No, I'm not saying that. Am I claiming that Shin Buddhism is the ultimate destination for all religious people? I'm not saying that either. What I think I'm saying is that in Buddhism, truth is by definition beyond our thinking, our words, our understanding. Falsity dwells in the relentless machinations of our ego to bolster itself. It's a source and product of our greed and anger and foolishness. For me, as a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist, this is my trust in Amida's vow. This is how the name speaks to me. These are the words from Tanisho, a record and lament of divergences, in which Yuyen cites and quotes the words of his master Shinran. I know nothing at all of good or evil. For if I could knowing thoroughly that, as Amida Buddha knows, and Amida Tathagata knows, that an act was good, then I would know good. If I could know thoroughly, as the Tathagata knows, that an act was evil, then I would know evil. But for a foolish being, full of blind passions, in this fleeting world, this burning house, all matters without exception are empty and false, totally without truth and sincerity. The Nembutsu alone is true and real. All else, all teachings, philosophies, religions, histories, experiences, all relationships that speak to us and stories that pierce our heart, they all function within the realm of the middle, outside of the duality of truth or falsity, and yet they act to bring us beyond ourselves, beyond our ego, attachment, prejudices, bias, agendas, and devices. Shinran says regarding Shinjin, It is simply Shingyo, that is inconceivable, inexplicable, and indescribable, is like the medicine that eradicates all poisons. The medicine of the Tathagata's vow destroys the poisons of our wisdom and foolishness. It's truth itself. Shinjin, as I mentioned before, I believe, gives expression to the entirety of our religious lives. It's also the path or a process of deepening, of transformation from faith to awakening. And as we're guided by skillful means along the way, the light of wisdom unfolding as compassion empties us of our false claims to independence, agency, ableness, and omnipotence. In a very personal way, these words also speak to me, and I'm sure they speak to many of you, also from Tanisho. Here, once again, Yu Yen is quoting his master Shinran. When I consider deeply the vow of Amida, which arose from 5 kalpas of profound thought, I realized that it was entirely for the sake of myself alone. Then how I am filled with gratitude for the primal vow, in which Amida resolved to save me, though I am burdened with such heavy karma. Words can bring us comfort or fear. Ideas can promise us rebirth in the afterlife. When words or ideas are real or meaningful to us, and when they guide us through life, then they are skillful means. The activity of wisdom unfolding as compassion that enable us to live with hope and fulfillment. And through them, even and especially in the midst of our limited finite lives and individual selves, we're enabled to move beyond ourselves, to see with eyes that surpass the world, and no longer be restricted to life or death. I ask you to please join me in Gassho as we hear these words attributed to Shinran Shonin from the miscellaneous hymns. This poem is one of my favorite. It was also one of the favorite poems of many Shin Buddhists, and I'd like to share them with you at this time. Please join me in Gassho. Having heard the transcendent, compassionate vow, could it be that we are no longer beings mired in birth and death, though our defiled selves have not changed at all? Our hearts play in the Pure Land. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.